After ominous war dances, which increased in volume and intensity, Dingaan stood up and shouted, can you give that to us? Jessica, how do you pronounce that? Exactly, that's what I want to say. Babuleni Abataga. Kill the wizards. And that's when the cold-blooded murder began. From across the stream on the opposite hillside, Francois was reading his New Testament when a messenger rushed up to inform him that Dingaan had decided to kill the Boers, but he wasn't to be concerned. Owen looked with horror as he saw an immense multitude, about 9 to 10 Zulus to each Boer, dragging the helpless, unarmed victims to the fatal spot on the hill of execution. Many of the Boers were impaled on assegais, and they were all clubbed to death, and Piet Retief's young son was killed before his eyes. He was the last to die. And amongst the dead was the interpreter, Thomas Holsteed, the only Englishman of the party. And here is the memorial. You can actually see Holsteed's name there, the Englishman amongst them. And it also says on the same day, more than 30 Achterreërs who were with Piet Retief were also murdered by Dingaan. So this is actually at Dingaanstad on the hill of execution, and to the memory of those murdered by Dingaan on the 6th of February 1838. The various missionaries and the traders who had warned Piet Retief repeatedly questioned how such an intelligent and experienced man as Piet Retief could have been so thoroughly deceived, so utterly mesmerized by this tyrant Dingaan. Soon the sky above the hill of execution was black with vultures. I mean, they obviously knew this was a place where you did regular business. I'm sure that the vultures sort of hung around there, sort of like lawyers around Parliament, and these tow trucks around the N2. The heart and the liver of Piet Retief were brought to Dingaan, but the rest of the corpses were left out in the open on the hill of execution to later be discovered, along with Retief's blood-stained leather satchel containing the very same satchel containing the same treaty with Dingaan. It was almost 10 years to the month since Dingaan had murdered his half-brother Shaka to assume the chieftainship. So absolutely extraordinary how they could have trusted a man who could stab his own brother in the back, that he would somehow be honourable. And this was followed by the horrible massacres at Blokrans. About noon that fateful Tuesday, the 6th of February, Reverend Owen saw Dingaan sending out a huge army in the direction from where the Boers had come, and there was absolutely no doubt in his mind that worse was to come. In the early hours of 17th February, 10,000 Zulu warriors attacked the sleeping voortrekkers between the Bushmans and the Blokrans rivers. There was no moon that night. It was pitch dark. The trekkers awoke to the sounds of their dogs barking, and then wave after wave of Zulu warriors were stabbing men, women and children, wiping out entire families. The followers of Geert Maurits were more cautiously lagered and better prepared to defend themselves. Retief had disdained the need to have lagers, but Maurits was keeping his people in lagers. The followers of Piet Retief were spread out, and they were the most vulnerable, and they suffered the most deaths. Cyril Cilliers and Geert Maurits led the charges to rescue fleeing trekkers, and women and children as young as 10 years old fought tenaciously, selling their lives dearly. We know the story of Martinus Oosthuizen, who charged through the mass of Zulus to a wagon for resupplies of ammunition, and then back again through the mass of Zulus to help the people who are running short of ammunition to keep going in the battle, to particularly keep the beleaguered Van Rensburg surrounded on a hill going. The fighting continued until the afternoon of the 17th, when the Zulu army retreated, taking over 25,000 cattle, many horses and sheep with them, which basically left the trekkers destitute. Many hundreds of the Zulu attackers had been killed in the fierce fighting. As the voortrekkers began to count up the cost of their own dead, they grieved at the loss of 185 of their children murdered. Of the women, 56 were dead, including even grandmothers, many with multiple Ascar wounds. The murdered men were 40. Incredibly, some women had been horribly stabbed, were found to be alive amongst the piles of dead. For example, Johanna van der Merwe and Margarita Prinsloo each survived despite 20 Ascar wounds, and Clasina Leroux had 17 stab wounds and survived. I mean, that's just incomprehensible. As Geert Maurits organised mass burials for the slain trekkers, the sky was full of circling vultures. Sounds of weeping could be heard throughout the area. The Boers later found a town at the site of the massacre called Vienna, place of weeping. Well, that wasn't the end of it. On the 6th of April, a counterattack by a Boer commando led by two rival leaders, Piet Ace and Andreas Potgieter, who couldn't stand one another, so they didn't cooperate, and they were just divided anyway, and they were ambushed across the Buffalo River at Etaleni, sometimes known as the Battle of Etaleni. The British sent an expedition from Port Natal to assist the beleaguered trekkers, but not even that helped. 10 of the commandos were killed, including Piet Ace and his brave son Dirkie Ace, depicted here in the Voortrekker monument. He rode back to fight by his father's side to the very end. Very young boy. As this commander retreated, it became known as the Vlug Commando, or the fleeing commando. This was the darkest time of despair for the Voortrekkers. Death, disaster and dissension seemed to doom the ambitious enterprise. Here they'd had such great hopes of establishing a city on a hill and taking the gospel into the hinterland, and now, because of the treachery of Dingaan and the incredible gullibility and utter stupidity of Piet Retief, they were at the brink of total disaster. And the fact that Ace and Potgieter couldn't get on together didn't help either. It's at this point that Andries Pretorius came from the Transvaal. With the arrival of Andries Pretorius, there was fresh hope. The widow of Piet Retief declared of Andries Pretorius, "This man has been sent by God. He will help us obtain justice." Andries Pretorius was described as a dynamic, pistol-packing farmer from Graaf-Reinet. He was tall, imposing, in a well-cut suit with a pistol and cutlass always at his belt. He came with 60 Transvaal volunteers for the Wen Commando, the winning commando, that he intended to organize. At an assembly of the Volksraad, Pretorius was elected Commandant General, I think within 2 days of arriving, and they headed out to engage the Zulu. Within a couple of days, he was heading out with 464 men and 64 wagons. Now, I've seen different statistics for it. Some will have different numbers, like that they start out with 57 wagons, but that's because some English people from Port Natal joined them afterwards, and that's why I've got the total amount. They didn't start out with this many, but by the time they got to Blood River, then Corm River, there were the Englishmen there as well, and so then it was 464 men and 64 wagons to engage the Zulu. I've also seen that there's disagreements between whether there's 1, 2 or 3 cannon, but I think you've got to allow for the fact that the larger number was probably accurate. Very small cannon, but still. And Pretorius adopted the motto, Eendracht maakt Macht. In unity there is strength, which then became the motto of the Transvaal Republic under Paul Kruger. All in the Wen Commando, or the Victory Commando, were lectured on discipline, Christian conduct, decency, integrity, compassion and courage. They determined to not make the same mistakes of Piet Retief, not make the same mistakes of Ace and Potgieter, but they had to work together, and it's been commented that probably the Afrikaans people were never more united before or since than at that time. They were the most united they've ever been for this battle. As God soldiers, their conduct had to be of the highest standard. Their chaplain, Cyril Cilliers, who was widely respected as a man of God and had proved himself in battle at Vechtkorp, ensured strict religious observance of daily devotions and prayer times where the men were required to kneel. Now, it should be noted, by the way, although the Dutch Formed Church later honoured the Voortrekkers and adopted them, at the time of the Great Trek, the Dutch Formed Church in the Cape took the British government's position that the Voortrekkers were going against the authorities, and therefore in leaving, they were leaving the church too, and they wouldn't allow any ministers to go with them. So Cyril Cilliers was not ordained by the Dutch Formed Church, and they wouldn't recognise him because he was going with these rebels. And so the Dutch Formed Church at that time supported the British government and opposed the Voortrekkers, although you wouldn't know it the way they wrote the history later. It seems they have frequently followed the government line, whether it was when the British ran the Cape or later when the Voortrekkers were victorious, or even to this day where they will, in many cases, follow what the present government says. So that's why the Gereformeerde Church and the Herreformeerde Church got started. In fact, the Herreformeerde Kerk was the one that was started by the trekkers because the Dutch Formed Church wouldn't provide them with chaplains. But Cyril Cilliers was one of the first to have the courage to go with him and be identified with him, even when their cousins back in the Cape were shaking their head and saying, "You haven't got a chance, it's not going to work, and you're rebelling against the government, there's no way God can honour this."
Could the Dutch Reform people have been thinking that they were submitting to the government as it was, that was God's will for them?
Yes, that was exactly their position. And so in the Cape, the Dutch Formed Church officially opposed the Great Trek at that time.
Can you give a date more or less there?
Oh, here. Now we're talking 1838.
1838.
This is 1838.